Hello there and welcome. In this lesson, we're going to learn how to deal with files, especially writing into files and reading from files. Why do we even need this? Well, first of all, this is the most common way to save data. Because when we run our program, then some variables are changing, but eventually when the program is ended, everything is just deleted and goes back to the way it was. So in order to save some data, in order to make data persistent, we can save it into a file, and later we can also load it back into our program when we run it again. And this is exactly how we save games. We have our local save file. Obviously, we also have cloud options and things like that, but back in the day, every save game would have its own file, and this is where all this information would be stored. Now, other than saving, we have other things that we can do with it. For example, we can create a log file. So each time we have a log, it will be written into this file. And if something happens to our application, maybe it crashes, we can go to this logs file and look for what happened. We can also do other things. For example, instead of hard coding a lot of information in our classes, we can create a file that will contain all of this data and then simply load this data instead of having it inside of our classes. And I'm going to show you an example of this. So if we want to write something into a file, the simplest way will be to create a string that will hold some kind of path, and this will be the name or the path that our file will be located at. So for example, we have this data text, and it really depends on your IDE and the program you're working. In Visual Studio Code, when you create a file, then it will probably be created in the root of your project folder, or it will be created in one of these folders. So if you just give it the name, it will create it in the root, but obviously you can create other folders and then provide the exact location. Okay, so if it was inside of some kind of folder named file, then you can create this folder and provide a slash and the name of your file. Obviously, it can have more folders, but if you just want to create a file like this, provided the name, and it will be generated, and we're also going to see it. Then, to actually have some kind of data inside, we can create some kind of data variable. And obviously, in your actual program, it's going to be generated in a different way, but this is just for an example. And in order to write and create this file, we can use this file class. So this is a built-in class, and it has different methods. So you can go over these, but the one that we want to use is write all text. And then if we hover, you can see that it will ask us for a path and the contents. So the path is this thing over here, and obviously you can also just provide the actual path like this, and then the data. But if this is very long, it can get messy. That's why we can just provide the actual variable. So we provide the file path and we provide the data. So this text will be written into a file named data text. Now, the way this method works is that it creates a new file, writes the specified string to the file, and then closes the file. If the target file already exists, it is overwritten. So what this method does is it will look at this path and it will check if we have a file with this name in this location. If we don't have a file like this, it will create this file and it will write the string into the file. If we already have this file, it will delete whatever is inside and it will override it with this text. And now we can see how it works. We can simply run. And now we did not see any file getting generated, but we can look into one of these folders. And we can see this file over here, okay, this data.txt. So I guess that in Visual Studio Code, the files are getting generated inside the bin. I know that in Unity, when we generate a file, it's getting into the assets folder or some kind of persistent location on your device. So again, it depends if you're building to PC or to a mobile phone, but each ID will have its own location. So we can also click on this file and we have the content that we wrote inside. Now, if we do something else, and we still use the same method, it will simply find this file and it will override the previous data with the new data. So if we run this and we go back to our file, we can see that the data was overwritten. Now, what if we don't want to override this? What if we just want to add more text to it? Because usually we don't want to overwrite everything that is written, especially with logs. We want to add more logs. So to do this, we can use another method named append all text. And this will basically add the text over here and continue this text. So we can say this is the second line. And if we do it like this, it will add the text right after. So maybe we want to write it on a different line. So for this, we're going to use this \n, and that's a special combination that basically breaks the line. So by adding this in the beginning of our string, it will break the line first and it will add the text over here. Otherwise, it's going to add it over here. So now, because we use append and because we use this break line and we run the program, then we can see that it was written underneath. Obviously, this is just because we had some spacing, but if we remove the spacing and we do third line and we run, we can see that we got the third line and we can continue. So this is the basic way to write into files. Obviously, you can play around with the different methods and use the one that you need. But if we want to read from a file, because at this point we have this persistent data file and it's actually inside of our folder and we can use it. So it doesn't matter if we run the program or not, we do have this data and it is stored. So how to read from this file? In order to read from the file, we first need to check if this file exists. Otherwise, it's just going to give us an error because the file doesn't exist. So first we check if the file exists, and we can do this again with this file class and use this method exist, and we provide the path. So it will go and check if this file exists. And if it exists, then it will execute what is inside of this block. And in our case, we want to read the data. So let's just create a variable to store the data. File, read all text. And you can see this auto completion. And we provide the file path. So it's going to read everything from this file and it will store it inside the string. And then we can also print it, console, write line. Read data. And now if we run this program, it will print into the console the contents of the file, and we can see it over here. Obviously we added loaded, so that's why we see it over here. We can do something like this, again, break the line. And now it's going to be on a separate line. So this is the content of the file, and this is just something we added over here. So this is how we read from a file. Obviously, if the data is very complex, it won't help us to just get all the data and print it. Maybe we want to access the data. So for this, we can use JSON structure, and I'm going to talk about this in a moment, but we can also use other methods to read the data. For example, if we have some kind of file over here, and this file will contain some information about, let's say, Pokemon. Obviously, we don't want to have a list of all the Pokemon inside one of our classes. That's what I talked about. We don't want to hard code a lot of information inside of these classes. Maybe we want to have a file that will contain a list of all the Pokemon. And if you don't know, there are about 1,000 different Pokemon, so it's not going to be efficient to have them inside of the class. Instead, we can have a file that will contain all of this data. So let's just delete this file and let's create a new file. So I provide the file path, but I provide an empty string. So now it will just generate an empty file, okay? So without this, and now it will generate this empty file, and we can see it over here. It's just an empty file. So let's say I have a very long list of data, and this can be data that I did not write into the file, but rather I just created it beforehand. Maybe I have some kind of list of all the Pokemon. Okay, I'm going to copy something here. And I have these spacings, so let's just delete them. So this is a list of Pokemon. Obviously, these are just some of the Pokemon. But we can even have hundreds of Pokemon here. So let's say this is some kind of database of Pokemon names. Now, if we try to read from this file, it will simply print the entire list. But what if we want to get a specific name or a specific line? For this, we can use another method. For example, we can have a string array. And we can use this method read all lines. So instead of reading all the text, it will read line by line, and it will take each line and store it inside of a different string, inside of this array. So we provide a file path, and now it will store each line into a separate string. And then we can simply access these lines and print them. So for each line in lines, we can print each line, and then again it will simply loop over all of these lines and it will print us all of this information. But what if we want to access a specific line? Then we can specify the index of this array. So if we want to access the first one, the index will be 0, right? Because that's the first element of the array. So now it will basically access this one. Obviously, we don't want to loop, because if we loop, it will do something else completely. So we just want to access lines index 0, okay? So we're accessing the first one. We're just going to remove this for now. We're going to run the program, and it should print Bulbasaur. Okay, you can see it over here. Because we're taking this array that was populated with all of these names, and we're printing the first one. Now, if I want to access another one, for example, 5, 6, this one, then obviously I need to deduct 1 because it starts with 0, so this will be element 5. So if I want to access Charizard, I can provide element 5, and it's going to print Charizard. Obviously, it's not going to be very efficient because we don't always know the exact element, but we can do more things. For example, we can loop over this entire list or this entire array and then print only data that we need using conditional logic. So we can say something like, if line contains capital C, or line contains lowercase c, so if it contains an uppercase or a lowercase c, it will basically print the line. So now it will loop over all of these lines and will check if the Pokemon has a C. If it doesn't have a C, it will skip it, but if it has a C in its name, it will print it. So let's see if it works. And now we can see a list of all the Pokemon that have C in their name. We can see C here, and C here, C here. Okay, so this is just because we use this contains method that checks if we have a string or a part of a string inside of a string, because each line is a string by itself. And obviously we can play around with this even more, but the point is that we can preload some kind of list with information and then just access this file and load it into our program. Now, although we can use this in order to get data, this is not the most efficient way. The way we actually store and load data from a file is usually by using the JSON format. Let's just delete this Pokemon text and we're going to create our own new file. So instead of saying Pokemon txt, we can create another file, for example, some kind of person file or player file. And instead of generating a text file, we're going to generate a JSON file. So this JSON file is still a text file, but it will just be formatted in a different way. And now we're going to create this file. But before we create the file, we want to store the data inside of it in an efficient way. And for this, we're going to create a class for the person, and we're going to serialize this person class or person object into the JSON file. So it's going to be a very simple class, public class person. It's going to have a public string name, getter setter. It's going to have a public int age. And then we're going to create an empty constructor just because we want this option, and also a public person constructor, but this time we are going to be able to provide the name and the age. So we need to set them. Name is name and age is age. So we created a very simple class, and imagine this can be a player class, or maybe let's just rename this to, oh, not this. Let's just rename this to player. This will be the player name, and this will be the score. So maybe we have a player in our game, and we want to save the data of this player. We're not just going to print some kind of string into the text file. Otherwise, if we want to look for a specific player or maybe calculate something, we don't want to do very complicated manipulations of this string. Instead, we can save the data as an actual object. So we're going to transform the object into JSON format, and we're going to save it into the file. So instead of saying person JSON, let's just say players, or maybe save game. And then we're going to serialize this object into this file. So in order to serialize it, first we're going to create this object, person, player, new player. And we're going to provide it a name, so maybe Mike, and the score will be 1000. And then we're going to create a string JSON that will hold our text, and we're going to use this built-in class or utility that is named JSON serializer. And it has this serialize method. And inside, we simply need to provide the object that we want to serialize. In our case, it's the player. So this is an object that already contains a name, it contains a score, so it contains data, right? It's an actual object that we created, and we can serialize it by providing it into this utility. Now it will serialize this object and turn it into JSON format, and you're going to see how it looks. then we're simply going to write it into a file. This will be the file, so it's going to create this file as we still don't have it, and it's going to take the JSON string as the contents. So now if we run this, we can see that this file is generated and it also has this JSON extension. And if we click on it, we can see this JSON format. So this is JSON format. It basically has these curly braces that tell us that this is one object because we can have objects inside of objects. So this is a simple object. And then inside we have a key and a value. Okay, so this is the entire object. Then we have a key of name and a value of Mike, and also a key of score and a value of 1,000. So because it's a key and value, and because we can have objects nested into objects, it's very easy to deal with JSON files. So we use them a lot, especially in web requests for different APIs. We use them to store data and to load data. So if you still don't know what JSON is, you should learn about this a bit more because we use this a lot. So now that we have this information inside, we can get this data and actually use it in a better way instead of just doing what we did with the list beforehand. So again, we still need to check if the file exists, right? So if file exists, and we're going to provide it this file path. If it exists, then we're going to load the JSON. And this is the same thing that we did before. We're simply reading from this file and we're storing the JSON inside because it's just a string, right? And then we are going to create a new person object, a new player object. And we're going to use the same JSON serializer, but this time we're going to use the deserialize method. And this basically converts the string JSON back into an object. So we need to provide the actual class that we want to deserialize. It will be the player class, and also the content, which is this loaded JSON string. And now it will basically create a new object using this data. So think about this. It can be very useful, especially if we have a lot of players saved over here, and we can simply create all of these objects while we run the game, while we load the game. And we can also print this. So console, write line. And we can say something like name, loaded player. And now we don't need to do all of these if it contains, right? Like we did before, if it contains a name, we can simply go into this object and go into the name because it's an object. Then we can say age. And again, we can go into this loaded player object and look for the age. Do we have an age? Oh, score. Should be score. So this should be score. So unlike with the list of Pokemon where we had to actually check if the string has a C character or maybe it has a part of a string, which is very inefficient because we don't always know what kind of names we have or things like that. Here, because we took this entire JSON and we convert it back into an object, we can just go into this object and reference the name or reference the score. And if it's a much more complicated class, it will be much easier to deal with all of this instead of what we did before. And imagine that we have a list of many different players. We can create some kind of loop, maybe a for each, that will go over all of the names inside of this file. So this is much easier. And now if we run this, And now we can see loaded from file, name Mike, score 1000. And of course, we can create more of these. We can create a list of players and then write all the text inside. But the point is that we can save into a file and we can load from a file. So imagine you have a lot of scores here. You can simply copy this file and save it wherever you want because it's a simple file inside of your folder, inside of your project folder. If I open this folder, this is my project folder, right? We have our Pokédex class, we have our Pokemon class, we have our program class. And if we go into the bin, we're going to find this save game JSON. And if we double click on it, we can see our data. So imagine if we saved more classes, then we would have a list. Or I think that we probably would have some kind of list inside. And then inside of this list, we would have more objects. It really depends how we would structure this, but we would probably have a list of players and then we would save them inside of the same file. So that's how we write into files and read from files. Obviously, if you are going to use this in Unity, it's going to be a bit different because it has a different utility. We can still serialize and deserialize from JSON, but the classes will be a bit different. So I think it will be named something like JSON utility or something like that, but it's going to be very similar and it's going to be the same way. We create a class, we serialize the data into a file, and then we deserialize it back. And we can do many more things, but this is usually the way we save games and we load games. And we can also save data into files, maybe assets, maybe some kind of complex data that we don't want to store inside of our classes. Imagine we had a list of 1,000 Pokemon and we didn't want to write this inside of this class, right? We want to save them into some kind of file that we can always change. Maybe we can update this file from time to time. So that's all for this lesson. These are the basics of dealing with files. Obviously, things can be a bit more complicated, but usually we don't touch files that much unless it's related to saving and loading or these things that I mentioned, maybe logs. These are the things that we are doing with files. So that's all for this lesson. Thank you for watching. You can subscribe if you're still not a subscriber. You can leave a like. You can also check the other videos. And I'll see you next time.